I want to start out by saying that I am a subscriber to Black Pigeon Speaks and in general really like the work he puts out, but one of his most recent videos has led to my making this one in response to it. As someone who has studied history and even has a degree in it, one I have never used in a professional capacity, mind you, which I guess makes it a useless one, I could not let his factual inaccuracies and assumptions based off of them go. If they were minor, I would have. We can all get the small things wrong after all, and I'm not one who likes to nitpick. But he actually got a lot wrong in this video. Plus, to top things off, unlike pretty much all of his other videos, he did not provide one single source. The video I am referring to here is titled, How Racism Unintentionally Created a World Superpower. Links to it on both YouTube and BitChute are in the description, as are links to my sources and content related to this subject. If you haven't seen his video at this point, I suggest you take a few minutes to do so. In making mine with trying to clip out things I was addressing, it was becoming way more complicated than it needed to be. Because of this, it just made more sense to refer you to his video and allow you to watch it in its entirety. One of the main premises of his video is that racism in the Civil War had the unintentional consequence, for lack of a better term, of turning the United States into a world superpower. I contend this is a flawed premise, one that is based on feelings as opposed to any actual facts. In those 80 years, the United States was isolationist for the most part and only got involved in foreign affairs and wars after great reluctance. Both world wars being an example of this. During this time, the U.S. did not have any substantial standing army or military in general, never mind the equipment, supplies, or logistics to maintain them. The United States did not want to be a nation of military power on the world stage during those 8 decades. Having said this, the only way for Black Pigeon Speaks' premise for this video to make any sense, or at least seem feasible, is if you use the same logic that the alternative influencer network, 65 degrees of separation from the alt-right, connect the dots based on feelings over facts that is behind it, is used. I hate to say this too. By BPS's logic with his video, the Louisiana Purchaser buying Alaska from Russia would be just as much of a factor as the Civil War. So would the westward expansion and the Mexican-American War for that matter. As would Texas fighting and winning its independence from Mexico and then later joining the United States. All of these things led to it becoming the sizable nation it is, containing massive amounts of national resources that are at its disposal. The same resources that helped contribute to it becoming a superpower both militarily and economically, which was in large part due to the manufacturing capacity of the United States turning those resources into finished products. If you are going to give credit to any war or wars for turning the United States into a superpower, you don't have to go back a century and a half to do so. The Second World War and the Cold War that ensued afterwards are what turned the United States into a superpower. The fact that the North won the Civil War and reincorporated the Southern states back into itself had nothing to do with it. Even if the South had succeeded in breaking away, the Union was still in possession of the Western territories and their untapped resources. Not to mention the manufacturing of the North, in particular Northeast and New England. With that, odds are the United States would have continued on the path it did leading to where it is today, even without the Southern states. There is one thing though that people seem to forget is a major factor to the United States becoming a superpower: its nuclear capabilities. If it had not been the first nation to develop nuclear weapons during World War II, who is to say it would be one today? As you can see, there are many factors that led to the United States becoming the nation it is today, including its rise to superpower status. The Civil War and racism had little to do with it. Black Pigeon Speaks is entitled to his opinion though, which his claim is just that, his opinion. Even though I disagree with his opinion, that isn't what I have problems with. It is the factual inaccuracies that his opinion is based on that I have them with, which we are now going to get into, and there are multiple. With BPS's unusual lack of resources, I don't know if his research is bad or if he's trying to be dishonest in order to make his case in his video. I would like to believe his research is bad and give him the benefit of the doubt. The problem for me doing that is, he is anal about citing sources and they are nowhere to be found in the description. This has come back to bite creators in the ass when they've gone after him trying to smear both him and his work. Crouten T, along with his band of merry YouTube academics, are the poster children for this. In their gay ops, they decided to try to take Black Pigeon Speaks down, claiming he didn't cite his sources, because making YouTube videos is supposed to be like writing a thesis for a doctorate or something now. They did this because he tends to be meticulous in citing things, and it ended up blowing up in their faces. That being said, not seeing any on his video, with his claims and the historical inaccuracies they are based on, I felt it necessary to correct the record, so to speak. The first of the claims I want to address is that General Lee was successful early on in the war because of his brilliant generalship. Yes, Lee did win the overwhelming majority of battles early on. That is a matter of historical fact. But it is not because of his brilliant leadership. It had more to do with the inept leadership of the Union Army and the bad decisions made by Lincoln, such as ordering a poorly trained army to take the Confederate capital of Richmond against the counsel of his General-in-Chief, General Winfield Scott, for example. All of the generals-in-chief prior to Grant, of which there were 3, were not the right men for the job. One was too old to command in the field and the other 2 were not great tacticians. But neither was Lee for that matter. He was just better than they were at it. One thing these 3 generals-in-chief had in common that Grant did not was their lack of assertiveness and the constant seeking of approval from Lincoln regarding their battle plans down to even the smallest details. How they went about it almost makes it seem like they were children seeking approval from a parent. Grant did not do this. He was assertive. He went to Lincoln and would say, "I'm going to do this," and went about accomplishing it. Lincoln either approved it or didn't. He wasn't getting involved in the planning and offering up his opinions on strategy and tactics. That is what turned the tides of war against the Confederacy and in favor of the Union more than anything else. The next claim of Black Pigeon Speaks I'd like to address is regarding blacks in the Confederacy. For all intents and purposes, he is claiming that blacks did not serve in the Confederate Army, and if they did, it could have changed the tide of war. The thing is though, blacks did serve in the Confederacy and that didn't happen. Legally, up to the last month of the war, they were not allowed to fight, but they still did. It was one of those situations where there are some laws we enforce, others we turn a blind eye to. Some black Confederates were slaves ordered by their masters to fight. Others were slaves who were offered their freedom, and in some cases that of their families as well. But the majority of them were free blacks, some of whom were slave owners. Their numbers totaled between 3,000 and 6,000. Is that a substantial number? Not really, in all honesty. Not in comparison to the total number of Confederate soldiers at around 750,000. That does not mean that they did not contribute to the Confederate wins early on, because they did. One of these wins being the Battle of Manassas. During that battle, 3 black regiments took part on the side of the Confederacy. William Henry Johnson, a free black from Connecticut who fought as an independent soldier with the 8th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, wrote about their involvement, even blamed the Union's loss partially on them. He did this in the Pine and Palm, a black newspaper of the time. "We were defeated, routed and driven from the field. It was not alone the white man's victory, for it was won by slaves. Yes, the Confederate had 3 regiments of blacks in the field, and they maneuvered like veterans, and beat the Union men back. This is not guessing, but it is a fact." The black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, in publishing a short autobiography of a black Confederate named John Parker, corroborated the reporting of William Henry Johnson. Parker was a Virginia slave sent to Richmond to build batteries and breastworks. Once the work was completed, he was sent to Manassas to fight. He was assigned with 3 other slaves to an artillery unit. After the engagement, he remained on the battlefield for 2 weeks burying the dead, killing the wounded to put them out of their misery, and looting the corpses of the Union soldiers under the orders of his Confederate masters. Blacks also served the Confederacy beyond the battlefields as well. They did a lot of the work that was critical to its functioning during the war. Of course, some were servants to the officers, even soldiers in the Confederate Army. But they were also laborers and those who transported the materials and goods critical to the war. They built the infrastructure, such as roads. They constructed artillery batteries and fortifications for the Confederacy. They grew the crops and raised the livestock that fed the Confederate Army. They smelted iron, a material critical to the war effort. They even manufactured munitions and ordnance as well. Over 100,000 blacks, most of which were slaves, made up the workforce and kept the Confederacy going, at least in the early part of the war, that is. The use of black soldiers on the battlefield, even blacks in roles on the front lines that filled logistical needs, it sharply decreased after the early part of the war. This was due to the passing of the First and Second Confiscation Acts. Both, for all intents and purposes, freed any slave fighting for the Confederate military or whose work supported it. With the passing of the First Confiscation Act, blacks started deserting from the Confederate Army en masse. It did not matter if they were soldiers or laborers, they started making a run for the Union lines. With the Second Confiscation Act, it increased, as it did with the Emancipation Proclamation. By 1863, in some counties, the desertion rate of slaves from the Confederacy was upwards of 70%. It was so bad that slave owners increasingly refused the Confederacy, trying to seize them and press them into service, fearing they would just desert. It was at this time that any credible reports of black Confederate soldiers on the battlefield disappeared from the record. With the First and Second Confiscation Acts and the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln and the Union destroyed the Confederacy's ability to use blacks as soldiers on the battlefield, along with in logistical roles such as transporting supplies to the front lines as cooks and the like. Up to 70% of them, depending on the region, were fleeing to the Union. Yet Black Pigeon Speaks believes that if the proposal CSA Secretary of State Judah Benjamin and General Patrick Cleburne made to the Confederate Congress was adopted, it could very well have allowed the Confederacy to win a war of attrition. The problem is, even if they did enact it, it was too late for the Confederacy to offer blacks their freedom if they fought for the South. Not even their offer of freeing their families after the war would have made a difference. They had presented their proposal in the early months of 1864, well after slaves deserting had become a mass exodus. All you have to do is ask this one thing and you will see why Black Pigeon Speaks' claim the South could have possibly won the Civil War was not remotely based on facts. In 1864, why would any black fight for the Confederacy when it is losing a war with the Union, which has been freeing them from slavery wherever it goes in the South? Common sense dictates they wouldn't. So does the historical record. Once the Confederacy did enact this, which was in the last month of the war, they had only managed to get 100 volunteers to take the offer. If they had enacted it in 1864, the odds are most slaves would have taken the offer just to get close to Union lines so they could desert and cross them for guaranteed freedom. There wouldn't be much trust that the Confederacy, or their slave masters for that matter, would hold up their end of the deal and give them their freedom. Not when there would be no incentive to do so after the war if they had won. If the Confederacy in the very early stages of the war had made the offer of their freedom for fighting, as well as for their families after the war, then and only then it might have worked for the Confederacy and Black Pigeon Speaks might actually have something with his belief that they could have possibly won. The Union wouldn't have had much of anything to entice blacks not to take up arms against them, with the South doing it that early before the North could. But the North offered them freedom first with the Confiscation Acts and later with the Emancipation Proclamation. Once that happened, there was nothing that could be done to save the Confederacy. This takes us to the last thing I want to address from BPS's video. He tried to pass off Lee's belief about the draft riots in the North as a factual cause for them. What Lee believed was they showed that people of the North were tired of the war and its high casualties. There is a problem with this. It is nothing but an assumption, one that does not have facts backing it up. What sparked the draft riots was middle-class, poor, and immigrant able-bodied men being told they were going to be drafted to fight in the Civil War, that they were not going to have a choice in the matter unless they had money, because if they had $300 or could pay someone else to fight in their place, they could get a free pass. Which back then, $300 was the average yearly salary for someone in the middle class. This left most faced with going to war if their name was drawn in the lottery without any choice. Racism and fear was another factor to the riots as well. Regardless of the racism aspect though, because for some it wasn't about race, there was a fear the freed slaves would take their jobs and or lead to suppressed wages. This fear definitely played a part in the riots. The enacting of the draft was just the last straw for these people and caused things to go off like a powder keg. In closing, I hope I clearly showed the flaws and historical inaccuracies in Black Pigeon Speaks' video here. Feel free to read through the sources and related content links I have provided, as well as do your own research. I encourage your doing so. Everyone should know history. With that, I could say it is because of the old cliche that it repeats itself, which it does, but I won't do that. What I will say is this. The left are a bunch of revisionists who are trying to twist history and use it to their advantage in order to weaponize it in bringing about the things that they want in society. They have no shame in this regards. If you know history though, they lose the ability to do it and the power it affords them. Remember that. If you liked this video, depending on where you are watching it, please give it an upvote or thumbs up. If you want to know when new content of mine hits the internet, don't forget to subscribe to one or more of my social media or video accounts listed here. Also, with YouTube, don't forget to ring that bell. You can find all of my video content on both BitChute and YouTube. This may not be the case with other places I upload to, but I will try to minimize this happening. You are always welcome to interact with me at any of these sites on the list, so feel free to do so. If you have anything you want me to cover in a video, when it comes to news or current events, send it right along to me. I will try to do my best to cover it. As always, thank you for watching.